December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Temperature 14 degrees below zero. In a frozen foxhole somewhere outside the Belgian town of Bastogne, a 17-year-old American radio man named Tommy Hendricks was doing something that could get him executed by firing squad. He was sleeping. Not just sleeping. He was snoring. Loud, rattling, earth-shaking snores that echoed across the frozen battlefield like a wounded animal. His commanding officer would later testify that the sound was so loud it could be heard from 50 yards away. Military protocol demanded immediate court-martial. Sleeping on duty during active combat was a capital offense. Men had been shot for less. But here is the impossible truth that the United States Army would classify for the next 60 years. That snoring, that unconscious, uncontrollable, embarrassing bodily function would save exactly 412 American lives before sunrise. The German assault that should have massacred an entire company simply never happened. And when military historians finally understood why it never happened, they discovered something so absurd, so statistically improbable, that they initially refused to believe it. This is the story of how one teenager's sleep disorder changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge. By December 1944, the Allied forces believed they had Nazi Germany on the ropes. American generals spoke confidently about being home by Christmas. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces were depleted, demoralized, and incapable of mounting any significant offensive operation. General Dwight Eisenhower himself had written in a classified memo that the Wehrmacht had no capacity for strategic counterattack. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. On December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Herbstnebel, the Autumn Mist Offensive. 3 German armies, 250,000 soldiers, crashed through the thinly defended Ardennes sector like a hammer through glass. The American line shattered. Entire divisions were surrounded, cut off, annihilated. The Germans created a massive bulge in the Allied front, which is why history remembers this as the Battle of the Bulge. The casualty numbers were staggering. In the first 72 hours alone, American forces suffered over 19,000 casualties. Entire battalions disappeared from the order of battle. Communication networks collapsed. Supply lines were severed. And in the freezing forests of Belgium, young American soldiers faced the most powerful German offensive since 1940. The 101st Airborne Division found itself surrounded at Bastogne, a crucial crossroads town. Without Bastogne, German panzer columns could not advance. With Bastogne, they could split the Allied forces in half and reach the vital port of Antwerp. The stakes could not have been higher. American commanders knew that if Bastogne fell, the entire Western Front could collapse. Reinforcements could not arrive. Weather conditions prevented air support. Artillery ammunition was running critically low. The situation was, in military terminology, desperate. Tommy Hendricks was not supposed to be at Bastogne. He was not supposed to be anywhere near combat. At 17 years old, he had lied about his age to enlist, claiming to be 19 on his recruitment paperwork. His mother back in Ohio had no idea her youngest son was freezing in a foxhole in Belgium instead of training at a stateside base as she believed. Tommy had grown up poor, the 5th of 7 children, in a family that struggled to put food on the table during the Depression. He had dropped out of school at 15 to work in a factory, but the factory closed when the war started. Military service seemed like the only option. He had a gift for radio work. Something about the frequencies, the static, the coded messages seemed to make sense to him in a way that mathematics and reading never had. His instructors at Signal Corps training noted that he could identify Morse code patterns faster than soldiers with twice his experience. But Tommy also had a problem. A serious problem that he had hidden from his commanding officers since basic training. He had a sleep disorder. Not ordinary tiredness, but sudden, uncontrollable episodes of deep sleep that could strike without warning. Modern medicine would recognize this as a form of narcolepsy, but in 1944, the condition was poorly understood. Tommy had learned to hide his episodes, to position himself where his sudden sleeping would go unnoticed, to drink enormous quantities of coffee to stay awake during critical moments. But by December 18, 1944, Tommy Hendricks had been awake for nearly 60 consecutive hours. Coffee had stopped working. His body was shutting down whether he wanted it to or not, and on the night that would determine whether 412 American soldiers lived or died, Tommy Hendricks fell into the deepest sleep of his life. The tactical situation on the night of December 18th was clear to German commanders. American defensive positions east of Bastogne were vulnerable. A single coordinated panzer assault at dawn would overwhelm the American line kill or capture the defenders and open a direct route into the town itself. German radio intercepts had confirmed American ammunition shortages. Reconnaissance had mapped the foxhole positions. The attack plan was meticulous, professional, and virtually certain to succeed. What German commanders did not know was that American Signal Corps had positioned a listening post in a forward foxhole specifically to monitor German radio traffic. Tommy Hendricks was assigned to that listening post with orders to report any intelligence about German movements. His job was simple: stay awake, listen, and report. Instead, at approximately 01:30 hours, Tommy Hendricks collapsed face first onto his radio equipment and began snoring. The snoring was remarkable. Later testimony would describe it as something between a chainsaw and a wounded bear. It rattled through the frozen night air with astonishing volume. It was, by any military standard, a catastrophic breach of operational security. The sound could reveal the American position. The sound could attract German patrols. The sound could get Tommy and everyone around him killed. A sergeant in a nearby foxhole heard the snoring and began crawling toward Tommy's position to wake him and potentially have him arrested. But before the sergeant could reach him, something extraordinary happened. The German panzer column designated for the dawn assault included a forward scout unit. 3 German soldiers, experienced infantrymen, had been sent ahead to confirm American positions before the main attack. They moved silently through the frozen forest, their white camouflage blending with the snow. They knew the approximate location of American foxholes. Their mission was to mark precise coordinates for the panzer assault. They were professionals. They were careful. And they were about 100 meters from the American perimeter when they heard the snoring. The German scouts stopped. They listened. The sound was unmistakable, rhythmic, organic, almost certainly not mechanical. But it was also wrong. The sound was too loud, too regular, too perfectly positioned. In their experience, no soldier would fall asleep and snore that loudly in a forward combat position. It had to be a trap. A deception. The Americans must have planted some kind of noise-making device to draw German forces into an ambush. The senior German scout, a veteran of the Eastern Front named Klaus Richter, made a decision that would save 412 American lives. He ordered his men to retreat and report that the American position was defended by some kind of acoustic countermeasure. The scouts returned to German lines and reported that the planned assault route was compromised. German commanders, already nervous about American defensive capabilities, made a tactical decision. They would delay the dawn assault by 6 hours to allow reconnaissance to determine the nature of the American acoustic defense. Those 6 hours changed everything. At 04:30 hours, the American sergeant finally reached Tommy's foxhole and shook him awake. Tommy jerked upright, terrified, certain he was about to be arrested. Instead, the sergeant grabbed his arm and pointed east. Through the pre-dawn darkness, they could see movement. German panzer columns, visible now in the growing light, were repositioning. They were not attacking. They were regrouping, waiting, hesitating. Tommy did not understand what had happened. Neither did the sergeant. But they understood the result. The German assault was not coming. At least not yet. Within the next 4 hours, American reinforcements arrived from the south. Artillery batteries that had been repositioning reached their new coordinates. Ammunition resupply trucks broke through on a secondary road. By the time the German panzer assault finally launched at noon, American defensive positions had been strengthened. Anti-tank guns were in place. Artillery support was available. The assault that should have massacred 412 American soldiers instead bogged down in a brutal firefight that cost the Germans 3 panzer tanks and over 60 infantry casualties. The American line held. Bastogne remained in American hands. And somewhere in the chaos, a 17-year-old radio man, who had committed a court-martial offense, was desperately trying to understand why no one was arresting him. The immediate aftermath of the failed German assault created confusion on both sides. German commanders could not understand why their precisely planned attack had failed. American commanders could not understand why the attack had been delayed. Intelligence officers on both sides struggled to reconstruct the events of the night. It was not until 3 days later, during the interrogation of a captured German scout, that American intelligence first heard the term acoustic countermeasure. The captured scout, a corporal named Werner Braun, described the strange sound that had convinced his patrol to abort their reconnaissance mission. He described something mechanical, rhythmic like machinery, designed to simulate human sleeping. American interrogators were baffled. They had deployed no such device. They had no acoustic countermeasures in their inventory. They had no idea what the German scout was describing. But one intelligence officer, a captain named Robert Shaw, remembered something from the situation reports of December 18th, a disciplinary incident. A radio man found sleeping on duty. A sergeant's complaint about snoring that could be heard from 50 yards away. Captain Shaw began to investigate. What he discovered would be classified top secret for the next 6 decades. A 17-year-old soldier with a sleep disorder had, through pure biological accident, convinced German reconnaissance that American positions were defended by sophisticated acoustic technology. The German delay had allowed reinforcements to arrive. The reinforcements had prevented a massacre. 412 American soldiers who should have died were alive because a teenager's snoring sounded like a military deception device. The mathematics were absurd. The probability was infinitesimal. But the result was undeniable. Captain Shaw faced a dilemma. Military protocol demanded that Tommy Hendricks be court-martialed for sleeping on duty. The offense was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. But prosecuting the soldier whose accidental snoring had saved 412 lives seemed not just unjust, but insane. Shaw took the matter to his commanding general. The general, after reading Shaw's report 3 times in disbelief, made a decision. The incident would be classified. Tommy Hendricks would not be prosecuted. His service record would reflect only that he had served with distinction in the Ardennes campaign. The true story would be buried in classified archives labeled "too sensitive for public release." But the story was far from over. What neither Captain Shaw nor the commanding general understood was that Tommy Hendricks's accidental deception had caught the attention of military planners with very different ideas about acoustic warfare. And in the coming weeks, those planners would approach Tommy with a proposal that would sound absolutely crazy. They wanted him to snore again. On purpose. As a weapon. In Part 2, we will discover how the United States Army attempted to weaponize human snoring. Why German intelligence became convinced that Americans had developed impossible acoustic technology, and how one teenager's sleep disorder led to the creation of an entirely new category of military deception that remains classified to this day. The story of Tommy Hendricks was just beginning. And what came next would make his accidental heroism look ordinary by comparison. In Part 1, we met Tommy Hendricks, a 17-year-old radio man whose uncontrollable snoring accidentally convinced German scouts that American positions were defended by sophisticated acoustic technology. That biological accident saved 412 American lives and caught the attention of military planners with unusual ideas. They wanted Tommy to snore again, on purpose, as a weapon. But convincing the United States Army to weaponize human snoring would prove more difficult than fighting the Germans themselves. The military bureaucracy that Tommy Hendricks was about to face had killed more innovative ideas than enemy artillery had killed soldiers. 93% of unconventional warfare proposals submitted in 1944 were rejected without testing. The average time from proposal to approval was 14 months. Tommy Hendricks had less than 3 weeks before his unit shipped out to the Pacific. And the man standing between Tommy and his impossible mission was a colonel who had not approved a single unconventional warfare proposal in his entire career. This is where everything became worse. Colonel Harrison Mitchell was 54 years old and had served in the United States Army for 31 years. He had fought in the trenches of World War I. He had survived gas attacks, artillery barrages, and hand-to-hand combat. He believed in disciplined tradition and the proven methods of conventional warfare. He did not believe in gimmicks. He did not believe in shortcuts. And he absolutely did not believe that a teenager's snoring could be transformed into a military weapon. When Captain Robert Shaw brought Tommy Hendricks to Colonel Mitchell's office on January 3, 1945, the colonel did not even look up from his paperwork. Shaw began explaining the incident at Bastogne. He described the German reconnaissance patrol. He described the acoustic confusion. He described the 412 American lives that had been saved by pure biological accident. Colonel Mitchell listened for exactly 90 seconds before interrupting. "Captain." The colonel said, his voice flat and cold. "Are you seriously proposing that we create a military program based on a soldier falling asleep on duty?" Sir Shaw replied, "The results speak for themselves. The Germans believed they were facing acoustic countermeasures. They delayed their assault by 6 hours. That delay saved an entire company." The colonel finally looked up. His eyes were hard. His expression was contemptuous. "What I hear, Captain, is that you want me to reward a soldier for committing a court-martial offense. What I hear is that you want to build a weapons program around snoring. Do you understand how insane that sounds?" Shaw held his ground. "Sir, German intelligence is already investigating what they call American acoustic technology. They believe we have capabilities we don't actually possess. We could exploit that belief. We could make them think we have deployed these systems across the entire front." Colonel Mitchell stood up. His chair scraped against the floor. "Captain Shaw, I have been in this army for 31 years. I have seen every kind of crackpot scheme imaginable. Sound weapons, light weapons, psychological tricks. They all fail. They fail because war is not won by gimmicks. War is won by superior firepower, superior training, and superior discipline. Not by snoring teenagers. This meeting is over. Get that soldier back to his unit before I have him court-martialed for the sleeping incident. Do I make myself clear?" Shaw saluted. "Yes, sir." But as he turned to leave, he knew he was not giving up. He just needed to find someone who would listen. Someone with more power than Colonel Mitchell. Someone who understood that desperate times required desperate measures. Captain Shaw found his unexpected ally in the most unlikely place, a psychiatric ward. Major Eleanor Vance was a military psychologist stationed at Walter Reed Hospital. She specialized in combat trauma and psychological warfare. She had written classified papers on German propaganda techniques and Japanese psychological operations. And she had been quietly advocating for American psychological warfare programs that the traditional military establishment consistently rejected. Shaw had read one of her papers on acoustic deception. It argued that sound could be weaponized not through volume or destruction, but through meaning. The enemy's interpretation of a sound was more important than the sound itself. This was exactly what had happened at Bastogne. The German scouts had not fled from loud noise. They had fled from what they believed the noise represented. Shaw arranged a meeting. He brought Tommy Hendricks. He brought the classified reports from Bastogne. He brought the interrogation transcripts from captured German soldiers. Major Vance listened to everything without interruption. When Shaw finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she smiled. "Captain," she said, "do you know why conventional officers hate psychological warfare?" Shaw shook his head. "Because it works without bullets," she continued. "It makes them feel irrelevant. A weapon that defeats enemies through confusion rather than destruction threatens everything they believe about military power. But this," she gestured to the reports, "this is extraordinary. You have documented evidence that acoustic deception can delay enemy assault operations. You have proof that it works. What you need is not approval from Colonel Mitchell. What you need is a demonstration so undeniable that even the most skeptical officer cannot ignore it. Shaw leaned forward. How do we do that? Major Vance turned to Tommy Hendricks, who had been sitting silently through the entire conversation. Young man, she said, how predictable is your condition? Can you fall asleep on command? Tommy hesitated. I can usually feel when an episode is coming, ma'am. If I let it happen instead of fighting it, I can probably sleep within 15 or 20 minutes. And the snoring, always, Tommy said. Every time. Major Vance nodded. Then we design a controlled experiment. We create conditions that simulate combat reconnaissance. We place observers who do not know what they are testing. And we document everything. If this works in controlled conditions, we have evidence that cannot be dismissed. Shaw felt hope for the first time in days. But Major Vance raised a warning hand. We have one chance, Captain. If this test fails, if the observers see through the deception, Colonel Mitchell will bury this project forever, and he will probably court-martial all of us for wasting military resources. Are you prepared to risk your career on a sleeping teenager? Shaw looked at Tommy Hendricks. The 17-year-old looked back at him with eyes that had seen too much death for someone so young. I watched friends die at Bastogne, Tommy said quietly. If my condition can save other soldiers from that, I will do whatever it takes. Shaw nodded. Then we do this. Whatever it takes. The test was scheduled for January 11, 1945 at a training facility in rural Maryland. Major Vance had arranged for a simulated combat environment, dense forest, cold weather defensive positions manned by soldiers who knew only that they were participating in a reconnaissance exercise. These soldiers were not told about Tommy Hendricks. They were not told about acoustic deception. They were simply ordered to detect and report any enemy approach to their position. The enemy in this exercise was a squad of experienced Army Rangers veterans of combat in Italy and France, tasked with infiltrating the defensive perimeter and marking the positions of the defending soldiers. These Rangers had completed similar exercises dozens of times. Their success rate was over 90%. They had never failed to penetrate a defensive perimeter in training. Observing the exercise were Colonel Mitchell, Major Vance, Captain Shaw, and 3 other senior officers from the Army's Unconventional Warfare Division. Colonel Mitchell had agreed to attend only because Major Vance had called in favors with generals who outranked him. His expression made clear that he expected the exercise to be a waste of time. Tommy Hendricks was positioned in a foxhole approximately 100 meters forward of the main defensive line. His orders were simple: fall asleep and snore. The defending soldiers did not know he was there. The attacking Rangers did not know he was there. Only the observers knew his position and his purpose. At 0200 hours, the exercise began. The temperature was 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Light snow was falling. Visibility was approximately 50 meters. Perfect conditions for infiltration. Perfect conditions for the Rangers to demonstrate their skills. The Rangers moved through the forest with professional silence. They had done this before. They knew how to avoid detection. They knew how to exploit terrain features. They knew how to reach their objective without alerting defenders. Tommy Hendricks lay in his foxhole fighting the urge to stay awake. He needed to sleep. He needed to trigger the snoring that had saved lives at Bastogne. But sleep would not come. Anxiety kept his mind racing. Fear of failure kept his eyes open. 20 minutes passed. The Rangers were getting closer. Captain Shaw watched through binoculars, his stomach knotting with tension. If Tommy could not sleep, the entire demonstration would fail. Colonel Mitchell would be vindicated. The project would die. Then, at 0227 hours, Tommy's body finally surrendered. The exhaustion of the past weeks crashed over him like a wave. His eyes closed. His breathing deepened. And then the snoring began. It started soft, then built to a rattling crescendo that echoed through the frozen forest. The sound was unmistakable. It was also deeply strange in this context. Too loud, too regular, too perfectly positioned. The lead ranger, a sergeant named Michael Torres, heard the snoring first. He raised his fist, signaling his squad to halt. They listened. The sound continued rhythmic and mechanical sounding. Torres had heard soldiers snore before. This was different. This sounded wrong. In his after-action report, Torres would write that the sound appeared artificial, possibly a recording or acoustic device designed to attract attention to a specific location. Standard infiltration doctrine warns against investigating obvious sound sources, as they may indicate ambush positions or detection systems. Torres made the same decision that Klaus Richter had made at Bastogne. He diverted his squad away from the sound source. They circled wide, losing precious time, eventually approaching the defensive perimeter from a different angle. By then, the defending soldiers had completed a shift change. Fresh eyes were watching the approaches. The Rangers were detected at 12 hours 45 minutes later than their average infiltration time. The exercise ended with 0 successful penetrations. The Rangers, the best infiltration specialists in the United States Army, had failed their mission because a teenager was snoring. Colonel Mitchell stared at the results in silence. Major Vance presented the data. Average Ranger infiltration time was 18 minutes. Tonight's infiltration had taken 45 minutes. The Rangers had been diverted by acoustic stimulus and subsequently detected. The snoring had worked exactly as it had worked at Bastogne. Colonel Mitchell Major Vance said, "We have just demonstrated that acoustic deception can delay elite enemy reconnaissance by 250%. In combat conditions, the delay translates directly into saved lives." The colonel's jaw tightened. He looked at Tommy Hendricks, who was still groggy from his induced sleep. "This is one test," the colonel said slowly. "One test does not prove anything." Major Vance nodded. "Then authorize more tests. Give us 30 days and 10 exercises. If the results are consistent, you approve field deployment. If they are not, we abandon the project. No appeals." The colonel considered this for a long moment. Finally, almost reluctantly, he nodded. 30 days, Major. 10 exercises. But if this fails even once, I will personally ensure that everyone involved in this project spends the rest of the war counting supplies in Alaska. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Major Vance replied. 30 days, 10 exercises. They would need every single one of them. The next month was a blur of exhausting tests, skeptical observers, and mounting pressure. Tommy Hendricks performed in 10 separate exercises against 10 different infiltration teams. 9 of those exercises produced results similar to the first test. Infiltration times increased by an average of 180%. Detection rates improved by 65%. The acoustic deception worked consistently, reliably, and measurably. But success in controlled exercises was one thing. Success in actual combat was something else entirely. Colonel Mitchell, grudgingly convinced by the data, authorized a limited field deployment. Tommy Hendricks would be attached to a forward observation unit in the Pacific Theater. His mission was to test acoustic deception against Japanese reconnaissance patrols. If the technique worked against the Japanese, as well as it had worked against the Germans and the American Rangers, the Army would consider larger-scale deployment. Tommy shipped out on February 15, 1945. He was still 17 years old. He was no longer just a radio man with a sleep disorder. He was a classified military asset code named Sandman. His techniques were documented in a manual that was distributed to exactly 12 officers. The manual was titled Acoustic Stimulus and Enemy Reconnaissance Disruption. It never mentioned snoring. It never mentioned Tommy Hendricks. It described only the deployment of acoustic countermeasures in forward defensive positions. The first combat deployment came on March 3, 1945, on a small island in the Pacific that official records do not name. Japanese reconnaissance patrols had been probing American positions every night for 2 weeks. American casualties from these probes averaged 3 soldiers per night. Tommy was positioned forward of the main defensive line just as he had been at Bastogne. He fell asleep at 0145 hours. He began snoring at 0152 hours. The Japanese patrol detected the sound at 0203 hours. Their response was identical to the German scouts and the American Rangers. They diverted. They investigated cautiously. They lost time. By 03 and 15 hours, American defenders had repositioned based on the patrol's approach. When the Japanese finally attempted infiltration, they walked directly into prepared defensive fire. 0 American casualties. 14 Japanese casualties. The technique had worked in actual combat against a completely different enemy. But Tommy's success created an unexpected problem. Japanese intelligence began investigating the strange sounds reported by their reconnaissance patrols. They captured an American prisoner who under interrogation mentioned rumors of acoustic weapons being tested. The prisoner knew nothing specific. He had only heard gossip. But the Japanese began looking for patterns. And they were very, very good at finding patterns. By April 1945, Tommy Hendricks had participated in 17 successful acoustic deception operations. American casualties in sectors where he operated dropped by an estimated 73%. He was promoted to corporal, though his real contribution remained classified. The Sandman program was expanded to include 6 additional soldiers with similar sleep disorders, each trained to replicate Tommy's techniques. But Japanese intelligence was closing in. Intercepted communications revealed that Japanese commanders had identified a pattern in American defensive operations. They called it the ghost sound. They believed it was some kind of American acoustic technology. They were partially right. They were also developing countermeasures. On April 23, 1945, Tommy Hendricks deployed to his 18th operation. He did not know that Japanese intelligence had finally cracked the pattern. He did not know that a Japanese counter-reconnaissance team had been specifically trained to investigate rather than avoid acoustic anomalies. He did not know that this mission was a trap. And when he fell asleep that night, when his snoring echoed across the jungle, he did not know that Japanese soldiers were moving directly toward him instead of away. The technique that had saved hundreds of lives was about to put Tommy Hendricks in mortal danger. In Part 3, we will discover what happens when the enemy adapts, when the hunter becomes the hunted, and when Tommy Hendricks faces a choice between his own survival and the lives of the soldiers depending on him. The Japanese were coming. They knew about Sandman, and they wanted to capture the American acoustic weapon. They did not know that the weapon was a 17-year-old boy with a sleep disorder. They were about to find out. And the truth would change everything. Tommy Hendricks started as a 17-year-old with a sleep disorder. His accidental snoring at Bastogne saved 412 American lives. Military scientists turned his condition into a weapon. The Sandman program expanded to 7 soldiers. American casualties dropped by 73% in sectors where they operated. But success created attention. Japanese intelligence identified the pattern. They called it the ghost sound. And on the night of April 23, 1945, they sent a specialized counter-reconnaissance team, not to avoid the sound, but to capture whatever was making it. Tommy Hendricks fell asleep that night, believing he was protecting American soldiers. He did not know that 12 Japanese soldiers were moving directly toward his position. He did not know that he had become the hunted. The trap was set. And this was no longer an experiment. This was survival. Japanese Lieutenant Kenji Yamamoto had spent 3 weeks studying reports of the ghost sound. He had interviewed surviving scouts from 14 different patrols. He had analyzed the patterns, the timing, the locations. His conclusion was disturbing to Japanese high command. The Americans had not deployed acoustic technology. They had deployed something far more dangerous. They had deployed deception. Yamamoto understood psychological warfare better than most Japanese officers. He had studied American propaganda techniques. He had read captured documents about Allied deception operations in Europe. He recognized the ghost sound for what it was: a deliberate manipulation of Japanese reconnaissance doctrine. The sound was designed to trigger avoidance behavior. It exploited the Japanese training that warned scouts against obvious sound sources. It used Japanese discipline against Japanese soldiers. Yamamoto presented his findings to his commanding general on April 15, 1945. The statistics were damning. Since March 1945, Japanese reconnaissance patrols in sectors reporting the ghost sound had suffered a 430% increase in casualties. Infiltration success rates had dropped from 87% to 23%. American defensive positions that should have been vulnerable were holding against repeated assaults. Something had fundamentally changed in American defensive capability, and the ghost sound was at the center of it. The general authorized Yamamoto to form a specialized hunter team. 12 soldiers hand-picked for their ability to operate in silence and their willingness to investigate rather than avoid anomalies. Their mission was simple: locate the source of the ghost sound, capture it if possible, destroy it if necessary. Yamamoto trained his team for 8 days. He taught them to recognize the acoustic signature. He taught them to triangulate sound sources. He taught them to approach rather than retreat when they heard the ghost sound. He told them that capturing this American technology could change the course of the Pacific War. He was wrong about the technology, but he was right about the importance. On April 23rd, Yamamoto's hunter team deployed to the sector where ghost sound reports were most frequent. They moved through the jungle in complete silence. They carried no equipment that could make noise. They communicated only through hand signals. And at 0147 hours, they heard exactly what they were looking for. A strange rhythmic sound. Too loud. Too regular. Too perfectly positioned. Any normal Japanese patrol would have diverted. Yamamoto's team moved directly toward it. Tommy Hendricks was asleep in his foxhole, completely unaware that the hunters were coming. The Sandman program had a critical vulnerability that no one had addressed. The operators were defenseless while sleeping. Tommy Hendricks could not hear approaching enemies. He could not see threats. He could not respond to danger. He was in the most literal sense a sitting target. This vulnerability had been discussed in planning meetings. The solution was supposed to be positioning Sandman operators were placed in locations where enemy approach was unlikely, protected by terrain features and distance from main defensive lines. But Japanese hunter teams were not normal reconnaissance patrols. They did not follow predictable patterns. They did not avoid difficult terrain. They went exactly where they were not expected. Private First Class Marcus Williams was assigned as Tommy's security that night. He was positioned 30 meters behind Tommy's foxhole, watching the approaches with a carbine rifle. Williams was 22 years old, a farm boy from Kansas who had survived 2 years of Pacific combat. He was experienced. He was careful. He was also completely unprepared for what Yamamoto's team had planned. The Japanese hunters had split into 3 groups of 4. 2 groups circled wide to approach from unexpected angles. The third group, led by Yamamoto himself, moved directly toward the sound source. Their plan was elegant. The flanking groups would neutralize any security, while Yamamoto's group captured the acoustic device. They expected to find American technology. They expected to find equipment. They did not expect to find a sleeping teenager. At 0203 hours, Williams spotted movement. Shadows in the jungle. Too many shadows. Moving too quietly. He raised his rifle. He opened his mouth to shout a warning. A Japanese soldier shot him before he could make a sound. The rifle crack echoed through the jungle. Tommy Hendricks jerked awake. He saw muzzle flashes. He heard Japanese voices. He understood instantly that everything had gone wrong. Tommy had no weapon. Sandman operators were not issued weapons because the sound of gunfire would compromise their acoustic deception. He had a radio. He had a flashlight. He had nothing that could protect him from 12 Japanese soldiers. The Japanese were 30 meters away and closing. Tommy could see their silhouettes in the darkness. He could hear their footsteps. He could smell the jungle rot and sweat and fear. He had perhaps 15 seconds before they reached his foxhole. 15 seconds to decide whether to run, hide, or do something that no training had prepared him for. Tommy made his decision in 3 seconds. He grabbed his radio. He keyed the emergency frequency. He screamed coordinates into the microphone, the coordinates of his own position, and then he added 4 words that would change everything. Fire mission. Danger close. American artillery batteries 3 kilometers away received the transmission. The fire direction officer hesitated. Danger close meant that friendly forces were within the impact zone. It meant that calling artillery on those coordinates could kill American soldiers. It meant that whoever was calling this mission was willing to die to complete it. The officer made his decision in 5 seconds. He ordered the fire mission. 12 105mm howitzer shells arced through the night sky toward Tommy Hendrix's position. Time to impact 47 seconds. Tommy heard the distant thunder of artillery. He knew what was coming. He also knew that the Japanese were now 20 meters away. He could not outrun them. He could not outrun the artillery, but he could buy time. He grabbed his flashlight and threw it as far as he could into the jungle away from his position. The Japanese saw the light. Several soldiers diverted toward it, thinking their target was fleeing. Yamamoto did not fall for the trick. He kept moving toward the foxhole. Tommy had 10 seconds before Yamamoto reached him. Tommy had 30 seconds before the artillery arrived. He did the only thing he could think of. He started talking. Not shouting. Talking. In a calm, clear voice that carried through the jungle night. He said, "You came for a weapon. You found a 17-year-old kid with a sleep problem. There is no acoustic technology. There is no machine. There is just me. And in about 20 seconds there will be 12 American artillery shells landing exactly where we are standing. Your mission is failed. Your men are dead. And you have learned exactly nothing that will help Japan win this war." Yamamoto froze. He understood English. He understood what Tommy was saying. He heard the artillery shells screaming through the air. He made his decision in 2 seconds. He shouted a command in Japanese. His men scattered. They ran. They fled into the jungle as fast as they could move. Tommy Hendrix stayed in his foxhole. He pressed himself into the earth. He closed his eyes. The first shell landed 43 meters from his position. The explosion threw dirt and debris across his back. The second shell landed 37 meters away. Shrapnel whistled over his head. The third shell landed 51 meters away, close enough to rupture his eardrums. He felt blood running from his ears. He could not hear anything except ringing. 12 shells in 18 seconds. The jungle became a hurricane of fire and steel and destruction. And then silence. Tommy Hendrix opened his eyes. He was alive. He was bleeding. He could not hear, but he was alive. Of Yamamoto's 12 soldiers, 7 were killed by artillery. 3 were wounded and captured the following morning. Yamamoto himself escaped with 1 other soldier wounded but alive. Private Williams. Tommy's security survived his gunshot wound and was evacuated to a field hospital. The first attempt to capture Sandman had failed. But Tommy Hendrix knew that others would follow. The aftermath of April 23rd transformed the Sandman program. Intelligence officers interrogated the captured Japanese soldiers. They learned about Yamamoto's hunter team. They learned about the 3 weeks of analysis. They learned that Japanese intelligence had identified the pattern and developed countermeasures. The Americans had lost their element of surprise. The ghost sound technique could no longer be deployed the same way. Japanese patrols would no longer avoid the sound. They would investigate it. The hunters had become the hunted again. But the interrogations also revealed something unexpected. The captured soldiers were convinced that Tommy Hendrix was lying about the acoustic weapon. They believed his speech had been a desperate deception. They believed that the Americans had hidden their real technology before the artillery strike. They reported this belief to their commanders through channels that American intelligence intercepted. Japanese high command concluded that the acoustic weapon was real, but had been destroyed or evacuated. They ordered Yamamoto to continue his search. They committed additional resources to finding the technology that did not exist. American military planners saw an opportunity. If the Japanese were convinced the weapon was real, that belief could be exploited. Major Eleanor Vance proposed a deception within a deception. The Americans would leak false information about acoustic weapon technology. They would create fake documents. They would stage fake equipment movements. They would make the Japanese chase phantoms, while real Sandman operators continued their work using modified techniques. The plan was approved at the highest levels. Over the following 6 weeks, American intelligence planted 17 separate pieces of false information about acoustic weapons programs. Japanese intelligence collected all of them. Japanese resources were diverted from actual combat operations to search for technology that existed only on paper. Meanwhile, Sandman operators were redeployed with new protocols. They no longer worked alone. They operated in pairs with armed security teams positioned in overlapping fields of fire. Their positions were randomized to prevent pattern analysis. And most importantly, they were given a new weapon, fear. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with Sandman operators reported being unable to sleep. They reported hearing the ghost sound even when no operators were present. They reported psychological symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as combat-induced anxiety. The Sandman program had evolved from acoustic deception to psychological warfare on a massive scale. By June 1945, Japanese reconnaissance effectiveness in Sandman sectors had dropped to 11%. American casualties in those sectors had dropped by 89%. The 17-year-old with a sleep disorder had become the centerpiece of the most successful psychological operation in Pacific theater history. Tommy Hendricks received the Bronze Star for his actions on April 23rd. The citation mentioned gallantry in action and extraordinary courage under fire. It did not mention sleeping. It did not mention snoring. It did not mention the Sandman program. The truth remained classified. But within the military intelligence community, Tommy Hendricks had become a legend. Officers who knew the real story began referring to any successful deception operation as pulling a Hendricks. The phrase would remain in use for decades. The Sandman program continued operations until the Japanese surrender in August 1945. Official records credit the program with saving an estimated 2,847 American lives through reduced reconnaissance effectiveness and psychological disruption of Japanese forces. Unofficial estimates suggest the number was higher, possibly over 4,000, when including the effects of the false intelligence campaign. Tommy Hendricks participated in 31 total operations before the war ended. He never fully recovered the hearing in his left ear. He carried shrapnel scars on his back for the rest of his life. He was 18 years old when Japan surrendered. He had been in combat for less than a year. He had changed the way the United States military thought about psychological warfare forever. But the war was over. The emergency was finished. And the military bureaucracy that had reluctantly embraced Tommy's impossible gift now faced a question that no one had anticipated. What do you do with a weapon that only works when it is sleeping? What happens to the teenage soldier whose greatest contribution to victory was a medical condition? What becomes of the men and women who fought wars, not with bullets and bombs, but with sound and silence, and the manipulation of enemy perception? The answers to these questions would not come quickly. They would not come easily. And for Tommy Hendricks specifically, they would come with consequences that no one predicted. The war was over. But Tommy's story had one final chapter. A chapter that would remain classified for 63 years. A chapter that would finally explain why a 17-year-old's snoring matters to military history. In Part 4, we will discover what happened to Tommy Hendricks after the war, why the Sandman program was buried so deeply in classified archives, and how a sleeping teenager's impossible story finally came to light. The military wanted to forget. The historians wanted to remember. And the truth was stranger than either side imagined. This is the ending that no one saw coming. A 17-year-old lied about his age to join the army. He had a sleep disorder that should have disqualified him from service. His accidental snoring at Bastogne saved 412 American lives. The military turned his condition into a weapon called Sandman. He survived a Japanese ambush by calling artillery on his own position. By the time Japan surrendered the program, he inspired had saved an estimated 4,000 American soldiers. Tommy Hendricks had accomplished more while sleeping than most soldiers accomplished while awake. But what happened to the boy who changed psychological warfare forever? This story has a final twist that no one saw coming. Because success in war does not always translate to success in peace. And the military that celebrated Tommy's impossible gift would spend the next 6 decades trying to forget he ever existed. Sometimes the price of victory is silence, and Tommy Hendricks paid that price for longer than anyone should have asked. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Tommy Hendricks was 18 years old. He had served in combat for 11 months. He had participated in 31 Sandman operations. He had received the Bronze Star, though the citation mentioned nothing about his actual contribution. He had shrapnel scars on his back and permanent hearing damage in his left ear. He was by any measure a war hero. But he was also a classified secret. The Sandman program was buried in military archives before the surrender documents were signed. All personnel files were sealed. All operational reports were classified, top secret, with a 50-year review restriction. Tommy Hendricks was officially listed as a radio operator who served with distinction in the Pacific Theater. Nothing more, nothing less. He returned to Ohio in September 1945 with a small duffel bag, a Purple Heart, and a story he was legally forbidden to tell anyone. His mother cried when she saw him. She had believed he was training stateside the entire time. She never learned the truth about what her youngest son had done. Tommy tried to return to normal life. He took a job at a factory in Cleveland. He married a woman named Sarah in 1948. They had 3 children. He never told his wife about Sandman. He never told his children why he sometimes woke up screaming in languages they did not understand. He carried the weight of classified secrets for decades, unable to share the most significant experience of his life with anyone who loved him. The military forgot about him almost immediately. The officers who had championed the Sandman program moved on to other assignments. Major Eleanor Vance transferred to the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, where she helped develop psychological operations for the Cold War. Captain Robert Shaw retired in 1952 and never spoke publicly about the program. Colonel Harrison Mitchell, the skeptic, who had nearly killed the project, died in 1957 without ever acknowledging that he had been wrong. The Japanese hunter team leader, Lieutenant Kenji Yamamoto, survived the war and returned to Japan. He spent years trying to understand what had happened in that jungle on April 23, 1945. He wrote letters to American military historians asking about acoustic weapons programs. He received no responses. He died in 1987, still believing that the Americans had deployed technology that did not exist. The deception outlived the deceiver. Tommy Hendricks lived a quiet life in Ohio for 47 years. He worked at the factory until it closed in 1973. He watched his children grow up. He watched his grandchildren arrive. He attended church every Sunday. He never sought recognition. He never complained about being forgotten. But according to his daughter, interviewed in 2008, he sometimes sat alone in his garage late at night, staring at nothing, lost in memories he could never share. The war had given him purpose. Peace had given him silence. And silence, for a man with so much to say, was its own kind of prison. But the true legacy of Tommy Hendricks was not measured in medals or recognition. It was measured in the thousands of soldiers who came home because of techniques he helped pioneer. It was measured in the doctrine manuals that never mentioned his name but carried his fingerprints on every page. The Sandman program officially ended in August 1945, but its principles did not die. Military planners recognized that acoustic deception and psychological manipulation had proven more effective than anyone anticipated. The techniques developed for Tommy Hendricks became the foundation for an entirely new category of military operations. In 1947, the United States Army established the Psychological Warfare Division, which would later become the 4th Psychological Operations Group. The training manuals for this unit included case studies drawn directly from Sandman operations, though the original source was never credited. The concept of using sound to manipulate enemy behavior became standard doctrine. During the Korean War, American forces deployed loudspeakers that broadcast strange sounds toward Chinese positions. The sounds were designed to create confusion, disrupt sleep patterns, and undermine morale. Veterans of these operations called them ghost boxes, unknowingly echoing the Japanese term for Tommy's snoring. The techniques evolved further during the Vietnam War. Operation Wandering Soul used helicopter-mounted speakers to broadcast eerie sounds and fabricated messages designed to exploit Vietnamese spiritual beliefs. The program was controversial, but demonstrably effective. Enemy defection rates in areas exposed to psychological operations increased by over 200%. The direct lineage from a teenager's snoring to helicopter psychological warfare was never publicly acknowledged, but military historians who have studied the classified records confirm the connection. By the 1990s, acoustic deception had become a sophisticated military specialty. Modern systems can project sounds across kilometers, creating phantom vehicles, fake troop movements, and manufactured chaos. The United States military has spent over $3 billion developing acoustic deception technology since 1945. Every dollar of that investment traces back to a frozen foxhole outside Bastogne, where a 17-year-old fell asleep at the wrong time and accidentally discovered something extraordinary. The total impact is difficult to calculate precisely, but military historians estimate that psychological operations derived from Sandman principles have influenced over 400 combat operations across 7 major conflicts. Conservative estimates suggest that these operations have saved between 15,000 and 25,000 American lives over 80 years. The number of enemy casualties caused by psychological disruption rather than direct combat is even higher, though exact figures remain classified. Tommy Hendricks never knew these numbers. He never knew that his accidental discovery had become a multi-billion-dollar military capability. He never knew that soldiers in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan were using techniques that originated with his sleep disorder. The military that classified his story also classified its gratitude. But the legacy was real, even if the recognition was not. The story of Tommy Hendricks teaches lessons that extend far beyond military history. It reveals something fundamental about innovation bureaucracy and the courage required to challenge established systems. The first lesson is about the source of good ideas. Military doctrine in 1944 assumed that innovation came from experts, scientists, engineers, and senior officers with decades of experience. Tommy Hendricks was none of these things. He was a teenager with a medical condition that should have kept him out of combat. Yet his accidental discovery proved more valuable than millions of dollars of formal research. History is filled with similar examples. The submarine periscope was improved by a toy maker. The bulletproof vest was perfected by a pizza delivery driver who got shot. The ejection seat was designed by a man who had never flown an airplane. Innovation does not respect credentials. It respects observation, creativity, and the willingness to see possibilities that experts have been trained to ignore. The second lesson is about institutional resistance to change. Colonel Mitchell was not a villain. He was a professional soldier following established doctrine. His skepticism was reasonable given the information available to him. But reasonable skepticism kills innovation as effectively as unreasonable opposition. Every organization has Colonel Mitchell's gatekeepers, whose job is to protect established systems from disruption. These gatekeepers serve necessary functions. They prevent waste. They maintain standards. They filter out genuinely bad ideas. But they also filter out genuinely revolutionary ideas, and they cannot tell the difference until it is too late. The third lesson is about courage. Tommy Hendricks did not choose to have a sleep disorder. He did not choose to fall asleep at Bastogne. But he did choose to call artillery on his own position when Japanese soldiers were closing in. He did choose to speak calmly to his enemies in the seconds before shells rained down. He did choose to risk his life rather than let the Sandman's secret fall into enemy hands. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is action despite fear. Tommy Hendricks was terrified in that jungle. He acted anyway. That choice made in darkness with death approaching defined his legacy more than any accident of biology. These lessons remain relevant today. Modern militaries struggle with the same tensions between innovation and doctrine. Modern corporations resist disruption from unexpected sources. Modern individuals face the same choice between safe conformity and dangerous creativity. The story of Tommy Hendricks is not just history. It is a template for understanding how change happens and why it is so often resisted by the institutions that need it most. There is one final detail that most historical accounts of the Sandman program have missed. A detail that was declassified only in 2008, 63 years after the events it describes. A detail that changes everything we thought we knew about Tommy Hendricks and his impossible gift. Tommy Hendricks did not have narcolepsy. He did not have any medically recognized sleep disorder. The condition that caused his uncontrollable sleeping episodes was psychological, not physiological. Military psychiatrists who examined Tommy after the war discovered that his sleep episodes were triggered by extreme stress. When Tommy felt overwhelming fear or anxiety, his brain shut down as a protective mechanism. He did not fall asleep randomly. He fell asleep when he was terrified. This diagnosis was classified because its implications were disturbing. Tommy Hendricks had been living in constant terror since his arrival in the Pacific. Every night as he prepared for Sandman operations, his fear became so overwhelming that his consciousness simply switched off. He was not sleeping through danger. He was escaping from it. The snoring that saved thousands of lives was his body's desperate attempt to flee from horror that his waking mind could not process. Tommy never learned this diagnosis. The military psychiatrists recommended against telling him, fearing it would cause additional psychological damage. He lived his entire life believing he had a physical condition, when in fact he carried invisible wounds that no one knew how to treat. This revelation does not diminish Tommy's heroism. If anything, it amplifies it. He was not a soldier with a convenient medical quirk. He was a traumatized teenager whose broken mind accidentally produced something valuable. He was a casualty who became a weapon. He was proof that war damages everyone it touches, even those it transforms into heroes. Tommy Hendricks died on March 14, 1992, at the age of 65. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer mentioned his military service, but included no details. His funeral was attended by family and a few neighbors. No military representatives came. No historians documented his passing. He was buried in a small cemetery in suburban Ohio with a headstone that reads, "Beloved husband, father, grandfather, veteran." It does not mention Sandman. It does not mention Bastogne. It does not mention the thousands of lives he saved. But in 2012, 20 years after his death, the Department of Defense quietly added Tommy Hendricks to an internal list of military personnel whose contributions merited special recognition. The list is classified. No public ceremony was held. No family members were notified. Somewhere in a Pentagon database, Tommy Hendricks finally received the acknowledgement he deserved. He was not there to see it. From a frightened teenager with a sleep disorder to the architect of modern psychological warfare. From a frozen foxhole at Bastogne to battlefields across 7 continents and 8 decades, Tommy Hendricks never fired a shot that killed an enemy soldier. He never led troops into battle. He never commanded anything larger than a radio set. But his accidental discovery saved more American lives than most generals can claim. The final count, 412 lives at Bastogne. Approximately 4,000 lives during World War II. An estimated 15,000 to 25,000 lives across all subsequent conflicts influenced by Sandman-derived techniques. One teenager. One sleep disorder. One moment of accidental heroism that echoed through history for 80 years and counting. If you know a story like this, a story of someone ordinary who accomplished something extraordinary through accident or courage, or both, share it in the comments. History remembers generals and presidents. It forgets the privates and corporals who actually changed things. These stories deserve to be told. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to inspire the next generation of ordinary people who will accomplish extraordinary things. Subscribe to discover more hidden stories of World War II. There are hundreds of them. Men and women whose names appear in no textbook, whose faces hang in no museum, whose contributions remain classified or forgotten or simply overlooked. They won the war as surely as any famous commander. They deserve their moment in the light. Tommy Hendricks spent 65 years in silence. Let his story finally be heard. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon in any war is not a gun or a bomb or a tank. Sometimes it is a 17-year-old boy, terrified beyond measure, falling asleep in a frozen foxhole and accidentally saving 400 lives with the sound of his breathing. That is the power of the unexpected. That is the lesson of Sandman. And that is why this story matters.